I call the Honourable Ruth Dyson.
Mr Chairman, it's a real pleasure for me to follow my colleague Dr Megan Woods, MP for Wigram, and obviously the local member for the area that we are discussing in these two bills. I want to first of all reflect on the fact, Mr Chairman, that I don't believe that we have seen this scenario before, where we've started off with the Riccarton Racecourse Development Enabling Bill as a government bill, and we've had the Riccarton Racecourse Bill as a local bill. They've gone to the Select Committee, and we've ended up with one bill, which is a government bill, or two bills being debated as one bill with all provisions in one part. It's very unusual for that process, and I think that it's worthy of note, but it's also worthwhile noting that this hasn't been something that's been imposed on Parliament during this debate, that it's something that Parliament has accepted, and I think that's a tribute to the way that the Select Committee has progressed the bills to this stage. So I want to put it on record that the work that all members of the Select Committee appear to have done has made the original two bills better, and also enabled for us to raise some of the concerns that we still have, regardless of the amendments that have been made, some of which have been referred to by Dr Woods. The primary purpose of the Riccarton Racecourse Bill is to look at the powers of the Board of Trustees and looks at how the income from this proposed development can be used, and that's important for Parliament to do. We've had a number of debates around pieces of legislation dealing with boards of trustees and whether that's appropriate in 2016 or whether in fact we should be looking at having such boards more properly act under the mandate of incorporated societies legislation or charities legislation, whatever the generic legislation might be. But in this case we've got yet another board, the Riccarton Racecourse Board of Trustees, being dealt with by specific legislation. But it is good for Parliament to be debating the broader issues, because it of course goes right to the heart of the lack of housing that we have for people in New Zealand generally. We are short of houses in a way that we have never been short of in our nation's history, and we are particularly changing the culture, the value, I suppose, of houses from a position where it certainly was when I grew up, that all of us knew that if we worked hard, saved hard, we'd be able to put a deposit on a house and one day own that home, whereas now, for many young New Zealanders, the idea of saving up and buying your own home is just completely off the agenda. So that's something that it's important for Parliament to reflect on, because it does change a number of things. If a person is permanently in a rental, they are more vulnerable. They're more vulnerable to the whim of the landlord. They're more vulnerable to the rents going up. They're more vulnerable to a situation where they become less connected with their community. Their children might have to move not only home but school as a result of those things. So the security, not just of an individual family in a home, but of the broader community, is really important in the wider housing debate. The Clause 6 of the Riccarton Racecourse Development Enabling Bill touches at this very point, which is about the affordability of homes, and I think that it's debatable but quite sophisticated in the way that it has ended up in Clause 6. And I want to move on to what happens if the affordable homes aren't delivered. But of course there remains a debate that is certainly being held in Canterbury about whether $450,000 is a suitable determinant of a home that is affordable. That's the provision that's in this bill that we're debating. It goes on to say further on, after we have the requirement under Clause 6 of the number of affordable homes within this housing development, what happens if they're not delivered? I actually think that's something that the Select Committee hasn't focused on enough. We go from here's a requirement in the bill to have this number of affordable homes, and here's the compensation due to the Crown if that number of affordable homes is not delivered. What about some project management in between? What about some accountability of the people who are going to be running this development back to the Crown and indeed the City Council, who have given some indication of support of the provision of housing in this area. So I think there's a bit of a gap between, Mr Chairman.
The Honourable Ruth Dyson.
Thank you, Mr Chairman. I think there's a bit of a gap between the quite rigid and specified requirements for affordable housing in Clause 6 and then the penalty for non-provision just 3 clauses later in Clause 9. So I'd be interested in hearing perhaps from the Minister and the Chair, although I don't think he has any personal responsibility for housing provision in Christchurch under his portfolios, but perhaps the Chairman or another member of the committee may well make a contribution about whether the in-between situation was considered. I want to move on now to another concern or gap or requirement that's in this legislation that I think doesn't fit comfortably with the way the transition arrangements away from SERA, the Canterbury Earthquake Recovery Authority, and the total powers of the Minister, the Honourable Jerry Brownlee, have been revoked, been disestablished by this Parliament, and we have now moved into much more local control of decision-making and finally some drive for development and rebuilding in our city. In Clause 11 of the Riccarton Racecourse Development Enabling Bill, there is a specific provision which reads, Mr Chairman, it says, before making a recommendation under subsection 1, and subsection 1 is the Governor-General may, by order in council made on the recommendation of the Minister, approve a development scheme, clearly the housing development scheme that this bill relates to. But in subsection 2, it says, before making such a recommendation, the Minister must, A, consult the Minister for Canterbury Earthquake Recovery. Even though that authority, those wartime powers that were granted because we thought they were needed so soon after the September and February events, that's all been taken away. SERA has been disestablished. But here we have the Minister once again having his fingers in the pie looking for control. Fortunately, the relevant Minister also has to consult the Christchurch City Council, has to be satisfied that the scheme meets the requirements of the development scheme as outlined in the legislation, but also that Ngāi Tahu have been given the first right of refusal that's specified and that it will result in quality residential development. I just want to conclude my current contribution with a further word on that. Dr Megan Woods in her contribution mentioned the fact that when this development was originally proposed, it was described as being an exemplar housing development, and that since that date and today, the exemplary nature of the development has just disappeared. I think that that is an opportunity that has been given away by the government. It's an opportunity that's been lost for Cantabrians, and one which I think people were genuinely excited about it. When the Minister made that announcement, people looked at him believing he was telling the truth, and now we've seen no such indication in the legislation. There are a couple of other obvious shortcomings with this proposal in the lack of integration with transport particularly. This is a large number of houses that are being proposed. They're in a good spot. They're close to the university, they're close to the main traffic routes, they're close to very large shopping areas. All those things make them very attractive. Schools, etc. in the nearby facilities. They have an excellent Member of Parliament, and I know that that is a very important thing when people decide where to live, where to buy or rent a house. But Parliament and the Minister certainly hasn't taken the opportunity to talk to the Christchurch City Council about the infrastructure needs and how we could make sure that the requirements of this big housing development sit alongside the plans and ability of the Christchurch City Council to deliver. I don't want to see people causing more congestion because the opportunity for better planning hasn't been taken. Mr Chairman, overall I think this is going to be a very good step forward for Christchurch. As I say, I think it could have been even better if the exemplar nature of the proposal had been delivered by the Minister and it wasn't, if the City Council had been given the respect that they deserve for better integration of issues such as transport, and if the Select Committee had perhaps pushed the Minister a bit to deliver those things, we could have got even better legislation, but I'll be very happy to support it.
I call up